Hi, and welcome to the Business of Us podcast, where we explore the intersection of business, relationships, and family life. Season 2 of The Business of Us was intentionally structured as a guided journey through the three mountains, with an opening episode to set the framework, three focused conversations on each mountain, and today we're doing our closing episode to integrate what we've learned along the way. We began by exploring the first mountain, which is the pursuit of achievement. These conversations examined hustle culture, identity formation through work, and the ways that ambition can both fuel success and also quietly erode well being and connection when left unchecked. We then moved into the second mountain, which is a space that many high achievers reach after success but rarely name. These sessions unpacked burnout, disorientation, and the emotional letdown that can follow accomplishment, reframing exhaustion and dissatisfaction not as failure, but as signals calling for rest, recalibration, and deeper alignment. And our final three episodes were focused on the third mountain, where meaning, contribution, and relational depth take center stage. These conversations explored what it looks like to rebuild capacity, redefine success, and create lives and businesses that are sustainable, not just profitable. Please keep in mind that our podcast is for information only and is not therapy. If you need professional support, we recommend visiting psychologytoday.com. So, Cameron, I am excited to kind of debrief the second season today. So, I want to kick it over to you to lead us off on talking about that first mountain of achievement.
Likewise, thanks so much for setting this up. Yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes. We're just going to kind of reflect and walk through the episodes and the journey we've all been on. So, the first mountain, as you said, was all about digging into kind of that moment of truth that every couple faces when it goes from, for lack of a better word, feeling relatively easy or organic to when things get hard. And our first guest was an amazing writer and speaker, Nate Klemp. And Nate and his wife, who is also an amazing speaker and writer, have written one book called The 80/80 Marriage. They actually have another one coming soon. And so, Jamie, I want to get your take on, I pulled a few quotes from the episode. So one of the first things that Nate shared was this idea that fairness doesn't create closeness in relationships, that we've kind of got our GPS or our compass a little bit off kilter in the modern world because we think that fairness is a thing that's going to create a great relationship. And he says radical generosity is what creates closeness. What are your thoughts, Jamie? React to that.
I loved talking to Nate. I think I could have spent hours just listening to him talk through his experiences and the things that he's done. And I love the way that he sort of summarized what he had seen, in his own marriage. And I think he's spot on, right? It's sort of the difference between equal and equitable. That what is equitable, everybody getting what they need, doesn't equate to things being equal. And I think that this is really similar. And so positioning yourself as, to view things with radical generosity, right? That then everybody in theory gets what they need. And when our needs are met, our ability to be close to those around us goes up exponentially. And so I love the way that he put that.
I would generally agree. I think what comes up for me is this idea that so-called negative emotions, and I think all emotions are important and all emotions are valid in and of themselves. But I think one of the key distinctions that often we don't understand is that negative emotions are designed to focus us. So they tend to kind of narrow our, our aperture, so to speak, and what we see. And that can be really important. I mean, think of, a kid who's in danger or a boundary violation that's unacceptable. But it can also be really limiting. And so this move from focusing on fairness, which is probably going to be kind of, I would imagine, about justice, perhaps anger, whatever the emotions might be, to generosity, that positive emotions are designed to widen the aperture. They're designed to give us access to more options. And so I think, nothing is a panacea. And I don't think of this as like, these are obviously meant to be like, catchy headlines or catchy quotes. But I think just remembering that we have that option. So when things are really frustrating with our partner, there's kind of the negative emotions, which are, valid and worth exploring. But we have this option to do something really different and just say, I had a moment, I don't know, a couple weeks ago with Anna, my wife, and I don't remember what was going on, but it wasn't great. I think she was dealing with a lot and it had gotten kind of tense in our relationship. And I was really tempted to just kind of be petty. I probably was petty a few times, but I just left her a card saying that I loved her on top of her coffee in the morning, as I was not really in this kind of elevated state of mind, but that act of generosity allowed us to kind of step back from the moment. And so I think just that, yeah, that idea that remembering we have this option of radical generosity and it can create options that we might not see. I want to ask one other thing from this episode, Jamie. So I like this. Nate talked about the quote unquote perfect fight. And obviously conflict is a huge topic. I found really intriguing. He said that he tries to be really precise with logistics, because he said that, there's areas where it's not good to be precise, where you have some interpersonal tension with someone and maybe it's best to be vague. But that with logistics, he said he had like so many of his big fights with his wife would come when they were, okay, I'll be home tomorrow, but when tomorrow? I told you I got in at 1 a.m. this morning. That's very different than getting home at 5 p.m. or 7 p.m. So what are your thoughts on the value of being precise with logistics to remove friction in a relationship? Agree? Disagree? That's a pretty unequivocal statement.
I actually totally agree with that statement. And here's
Okay.
why. I think because, right, expectations that go unmet will inevitably lead to resentment. They just do, right?
Mhm.
And so if you can manage expectations by being really precise with logistics, it just reduces the amount of resentment that starts to crop up. There's also, I think, an efficiency aspect here, right? With like systems in place procedurally within a relationship, which sounds strange to put it in those terms. But I think that if you can really dial those components in, it opens up space elsewhere for more meaningful connection when you're not having to sort of be redundant with some of the logistics pieces or having expectations not be met. Right? If I'm expecting, my partner to be home at 6 and he walks in at 8, it's going to cause some issues, right? So I actually think it's spot on.
I agree too. I think, I actually took a lot of this from my work experiences where people would not want to make clear commitments. And the reason was I think we generally are unclear when we want to leave options open. But I think the problem is when we get to, I think that I'll say two quick things. I think the problem is when we're unclear, then as you said, we're setting ourselves up to disappoint the other person. Cause the other person may like quote unquote here, I'll have that on your desk by 3 p.m. when I say I'll have it to you tomorrow. And I might be thinking 11:59 p.m. So that's just a formula for messing things up. But the other thing I think is more how as a team, couples, or really any group of people can support each other in setting clear expectations is committing to clear commitments, renegotiating them if you're not going to make them in advance. So you don't say 3 p.m. on your desk tomorrow and then, and then at 6:15 p.m. say, I'm really overwhelmed. Sorry, I'll get it to you next week. You got to let them know at 2:30 p.m. so they have a little bit of time to recalibrate, or ideally even sooner. And then you have to reward that behavior, right? So you have to say, great, thank you. Let's have that renegotiation around the new date and not flip your lid at somebody missing a deadline, because life is just, there's too much to never miss a deadline. And we know perfectionism doesn't take us to good places. All right. So the next episode, by far the best. I'm kidding. This is the one where I was interviewed. So we called it Making It Work Through the Chaos. So Jamie, I've said this a few times. I want to hear your reaction. So I've said that our relationship to the business as an entrepreneur may be the single biggest factor in our relationship with our spouse. What are your thoughts about that comment?
I think it's really symbiotic. So I think that our relationship with the business is the biggest factor in our relationship with our spouse, and I think our relationship with our spouse is also a big factor in our relationship with the business, right? And when that's functioning well, you know the difference between when it's functioning well versus when it's not functioning well. I mean, we've talked about this too, but just that sort of phenomena of the business being the third wheel, the affair partner. I think back to what you said about the brain chemistry around businesses to entrepreneurs and the, same parts to the brain getting activated at loss of business to loss of child, which seems like such an extreme comparison to make, right? And yet when you look at the research that it's really clear. So I think that having a healthy relationship with the business allows us to have a healthy relationship with spouse and vice versa. But if one of those starts to go off track, at some point it bleeds over into the other.
All right, I want to move on to the next episode. So this was a really moving episode on many levels. This was Greg and Diana Keys. And we called this From Breaking Point to Breakthrough. And they've actually been together for many years at this point. Their kids are in their 20s, but we really centered the episode on this moment where the business, which was primarily Greg's, he was the founder and the leader of it. Diana did some work in it at this point, but it just reached a breaking point. There were issues with business partners and it was losing money. And it was just sort of that unfortunately classic challenge that can happen in entrepreneurship where you put all your eggs in one basket and that basket looks like, it's got a big hole in the bottom and the eggs are going to fall and crack. I don't know how far I'm going to take this metaphor, but so there was this really powerful moment where Greg shared that, he really didn't know what to do. And I think he was, he talked about throwing up. He talked about not, being willing to go home because he was just so depressed and unhappy, and who knows how far that could have gone. And he summarized it as saying, I thought I had to be Atlas, holding up the world alone. And I was wrong. And Diana then said that was the first time that she saw him be vulnerable. And it was when they finally became a team, I think probably maybe 8 to 10 years into their relationship. So what are your thoughts about how an entrepreneur can be vulnerable with their partner about their business ups and downs when indeed the stakes are very high? They may have put all their eggs in the basket. And how can that turn into something where they become a team versus they become adversaries or disappointed partners?
It's a good question. I really enjoyed all of the guests that we had on this season. Actually, Greg and Diana, you could feel the connection that they had during their conversation about this and how emotional Greg became around describing this point in time for them. And I think, one of the things that entrepreneurs struggle with sometimes is that feeling that I have to hold all of this and going home then and not sharing critical information. And most of the time that is done in an attempt to shield our partner from the level of stress that we're carrying. Right. And so the side effect of that though is that our spouse picks up on our stress anyways, right? They know that something is not right, but they don't necessarily have the context around the emotion. And so when we don't have the context, we tend to fill that in and it's not usually in a positive way. Right. And so I think getting to the point where you can show up and say, this is really hard and I'm struggling and I can't hold this all on my own, that it allows you to really lean into and utilize the partnership in a different way. Right. It becomes that sort of soft landing space rather than that space of like, I have to hold this all together so that this person isn't, feeling the stress of the entrepreneurship. It's just a really powerful demonstration of that phenomena because I think that every entrepreneur goes through that at some point of like, how much do I share? When do I share it? How deep do I get? And having that sort of team aspect is really critical. So I think, the other thing that Greg said that really stood out to me was when he said, the business isn't what defines me anymore. Like it's not the only way that I can provide. And I think that actually even ties into what you were saying, right? When our relationship to business and how that impacts relationship with self. And so I'd love to hear how that resonates with you around defining yourself through business and how shifting that impacts the relationship.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, with my own personal relationship and then other people I know. And I absolutely think the right way to frame it is as a child. I used to think that was kind of hyperbolic, but when I interviewed 100 couples, it would just come up again and again that the business would be described as like another family member. And I think a lot of my interest with entrepreneurs and their relationships has landed on this idea of what kind of passion do we have for the business? Is it kind of an all-consuming one that feels kind of compulsive and addictive? Or is it one that feels more chosen and that it drives us to work on the business but amplifies other parts of our life? And those are called, obsessive and harmonious passion. And I was just talking to someone yesterday about this in the positive psychology program at University of Pennsylvania. And, one of the best predictors of the kind of relationship, the kind of passion we have for our business is, are we getting our needs met elsewhere? And so I think actually like what I said earlier about, are we widening the aperture or are we closing it? Are we tightening it? I think it's a similar effect. And so I think Ironically, maybe it'd be ironic if it was funny, because it's really not funny, but I think a lot of us get so focused on masking and showing up at work every day to get through the day and get to where we want to be, that we take that behavior home. And if we haven't worked on it a lot with our spouse, because often there is a lot riding on the business, it does have huge implications for the spouse and the whole family. But if we haven't learned how to have those conversations, we just carry that behavior over. And I think, this is kind of what Greg was getting to, is sooner or later that will catch up with you, because you will have built a wall between you and your partner and this person who, you really need to be there for you in the hard moments, and vice versa, obviously, but you need them to be there for you to be your, one of your key support people. They don't even know what's going on. They don't know how to support you because you've built this wall between each of you. So yeah, I thought it was well said. All right, I want to move on to the second mountain. So this is this idea of what happens when you actually get what you want. Sort of the classic, what is it? Be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. And so many of us in entrepreneurship, maybe all of us, we're looking for some kind of success, freedom, independence that comes, financial independence, however we frame it, but some sort of breaking free from a life of working till we're 65 and collecting retirement. And our first guest, who was really an expert on this topic, really focused on business exits. So Tom Bronson, we called it Defining Success Beyond the Exit. And he's been had a very successful career himself with a bunch of companies, but focuses on advising entrepreneurs and their families. And he told a really thought-provoking, powerful story of a couple who sold their business for 9 figures. 9 figures. So whatever. I know there's always someone with more money, but it's like you're in a good spot if you sold it for 9 figures. And then right before they got to signing the final paperwork, they learned that one of them wanted to go sail around the world, and the other one wanted to stay home and be with the grandkids all the time. So Tom said, another version of what we talked about, if your business is your identity, you'll lose yourself when you sell it, and that you need to be thinking about what comes after that second mountain, even though it may seem so hard to even get there. So what are your thoughts about that, Jamie?
I think that this mountain in particular, I think is really challenging for people to ask for support around. And here's why, right? Because, at this mountain, you've achieved, some level of external success, right? And so I think the expectation for people is that once I achieve this thing, then the stars are going to align and everything's going to be perfect. And then realizing that, one, none of that, makes you immune from the human condition or the human experience, right? And two, that it actually sort of amplifies, I think, some of the existing, issues. I think it really will highlight communication errors that have occurred. Some of those walls that you're talking about, right? I think become really, really prominent in this phase. And I think, the other thing that comes up for me around this is that there's also this sort of unwillingness to, not unwillingness, but hesitation almost to say, I'm struggling with this because externally things look really good, right? And so it's like, well, you've gotten everything that you want. So what could you possibly have to complain about? And so people are a little dissuaded, I think, from talking about the pain points in this mountain, even though they're critical pain points to talk about, and they're still relevant. And I think Tom's story there really hammers that home, where he's talking about, one wants to sail the world and the other one was like, you are out of your mind. We are staying home with these grandkids. Right. And so the reality is that it's not about the sailboat per se, but it's about the difference in perceptions on value systems and what people want to do, travel or stay with grandkids. That is an important conversation. The other thing that Tom said is communication is the thermostat of your marriage, to adjust it before things get too hot or too cold. Because I think if I remember correctly, this business deal almost blew up because of this discrepancy between these two partners, making sure that you're really clear on that. But I just think I hope that what people take away, part of the message that people take away from this is that it's okay to have pain points in all of the mountains. And just because you've achieved external success doesn't mean that those pain points go away. They actually become more nuanced. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, especially, as you've been through this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say my own personal experience, except for the 9-figure part, maps pretty closely. It felt like I'd kind of won the game of life. I think I really felt like, the financial pressures that I'd spent probably 20 years, 15 years living with were mostly gone. I mean, I think they're always there in some form, but I also had a lot of really interesting emotional reactions that came up, and times where I remember, feeling a real loss of meaning. I think I was kind of important, and a lot of people wanted to know what I thought. And my days were just full. They were structured. And all of a sudden I just had all this space. And it was exactly what I'd said I wanted to. I mean, no one drove the process other than me. But I think I, on some levels underestimated the significance of it and how big it was going to be. And I think to your point, I also was really lucky in that I had a really nicely phased exit where I just felt really good about all parts of it. And I've had a number of friends who've really had these kind of, you come in one day and you say, hey, I've sold the company to Jamie. This is Jamie. She's great. You're going to love her. And my email shuts off at 3 p.m. today. Thanks so much for the last 15 years working together. And they have these really abrupt changes, or they kind of get some big like media splash. And, I have a friend who had, it wasn't 9-figure, but it was a very good 8-figure exit. But they talked quite poignantly about how much that strained family relations, that, everyone in the family started expecting them to pay for everything. And there was, resentment and jealousy and loss of clarity on their part of kind of what they wanted to do. And really a lot, this ties to the next episode nicely, but the exhaustion from, years, maybe decades of driving so hard towards this goal, and kind of like a ultra marathon runner, when they cross the finish line, they've just given it everything they have, and they need a lot of space to recover and figure out what's next. And that's hard to stay attuned in the relationship, I think, at that moment. So I want to segue into the next episode, which you were the guest, and it was called Finding Purpose and Anchors Beyond Success. And you talked a lot about burnout, and I'm sure there's this related concept of brownout, right? Where you have power plants where you run them at capacity for years on end. And there's no time for maintenance. There's no time for recovery. And so perhaps it's not that the person falls apart, but the capacity just keeps declining. And so I guess whether we look at it as brownout or burnout, I'm curious, what are your thoughts now on couples where one or both of them have reached this point where it's not so much a chronic acute thing, it's kind of just a state of exhaustion? How do they stay connected? How does the partner who's not burned out stay connected? It's a big challenge in some levels, more than like a specific moment.
It is, right? And I think a big piece to this is expanding when you talk about finding purpose and anchors beyond entrepreneurial success. And what that really means is, what are the other things that fill you up, right? So when people are in this space of chronic exhaustion, chronic burnout, what I see is somebody that there's not this counterbalance in life, that everything has been put into this one thing, and it's just not sustainable in the long term, whether that's for the business or for the relationship, or sometimes both, sometimes one at the cost of the other. And so I think having a good idea of what are the things that fill you, what are the energy producers in my life, and being able to balance those with the energy draining aspects. And the interesting thing about this is that sometimes the business is both.
Right. It always was for me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's the thing that drives you. It's the thing that you are, you're passionate about. And there's moments where it gives you lots of energy and motivation. And then there's times where it is not. And I think that if we are too heavy-handed, and I mean, it's almost like diversifying, right? Like, what are the things
Yeah.
outside of the business that give me energy? And making sure that we're tending to those things as well, not in place of, but in addition to the things that you're doing in business, that tends to help that burnout space.
I love that framing of, yeah, what are the things that are energy producers? Okay, so our next episode was Mike and Jackie Schoenberger. This was a great episode. We could debrief on this for an hour alone. But there were two things I wanted to get your reaction to, Jamie. So Mike said the hardest work you'll ever do is yourself, and that if you don't love yourself, you won't be able to connect with each other as a couple. And this kind of came on the heels of, they had actually worked together for many years. They had a lot of success in business. There was no, in my understanding, there was no acute business stress. But Mike had sort of fallen into workaholism, and Jackie actually realized she felt like her calling at this point in life was something totally different. So she stopped running the business with him, went off and did this amazing kind of feng shui interior consulting And so it was that kind of, in both cases, what do we really want now? We've got all this success. All right, so I'll say it again. The hardest work you'll ever do is yourself. And if you don't love yourself, you can't connect with each other. What's your reaction to those quotes?
I mean, again, spot on. I think one of the things that I just loved about this season is that every couple that we had on, you could really, really feel their experience as they were talking through their journey. And I think this is something that actually I think surprises people sometimes when they come in for couples work is the recommendation first, like who in here is doing individual work? And as that being sort of a core question, because time and time again, I think that our ability to navigate life as a couple is contingent on our ability to deep dive individually and to grow as individuals. There's this concept, right? There's this like level of hyper independence. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got codependency. The goal is really interdependency, where it's like we have this ability to continue to show up as individuals, and yet we're interdependent in the sense that we're moving our lives together. And so I do think that it's always easier to look at your partner and be like, well, if they could just do X, Y, and Z, then I would be in a much better position, right? But the reality is that it's much harder to look at what you contribute, right? And so totally agree with everything that Mike said.
What comes up for me is one of my favorite questions when I give talks is I go, all right, raise my hand. Who here has ever thought that their partner could really benefit from therapy? And watching the reaction in the room is, everyone is like, in their head, they're thinking like, duh. And they're all like, oh gosh, my partner is sitting right next to me, or all these people are around me. And I think it's just such a natural thing. I like the way you said it, but it's just such a natural thing to think if only this person did X, then I would have all the things I want in the relationship. And it moves, it fits with how our society is structured with this focus on kind of this, ironically, this very individual worldview versus I think the harder, more nuanced, more meaningful worldview of something that actually sits between us. So it's not just that I'm going to do my individual work because I want to become self-actualized, but I'm going to think about what does that look like in the context of my relationship with my partner, and maybe something that I don't individually really want to do, but because I want these higher level things, I'm going to lean into this area. And I think that's an interesting distinction because often I think in entrepreneur communities, we're so focused on, write your epitaph, your eulogy, whatever it is, imagine that moment. But there's often this real focus on external successes and really kind of an individual story. Even if there's a partner and a family kind of that are supporting characters, it's a little different. And I want to segue from that because that goes really nicely into season three, the third mountain, the third part of season 2, where we talked about, what happens when your life has been organized around typically work and kids in some combination for so long, and they start to exit center stage. So it's not that you probably aren't engaged with those things, but they can, both work and kids can be so all consuming that they just force structure on our lives in a way that in many ways is really good, right? It's, an unstructured life can be very hard to navigate. And so our first guests were Brian and Jean Bro, that we had a great conversation with them, but I'm going to focus on one thing they said at the end, which was basically if you could they lead these amazing couples workshops, overseas and all over the US. And they're often for couples in this stage of life in the third mountain. So I said, all right, we've talked about a lot, but if we could just give one piece of advice, what would it be? And I love what Jean said, which is dream together. Never forget to dream together. So tying all this together, if you don't mind, Jamie, how can we do our own individual work, but keep dreaming together as a couple?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I think that is the right $1,000,000 question. How do we actually do that? There's a couple of pieces because I think there's this balancing between individual needs and dreams with the system need and dreams, right? And so it is continuing to do the individual piece, but it's exactly what you just said with the thought in mind that this is for the benefit of the system, my family system, couple system. And so I think having some dedicated time to actually dream together is necessary. I think a lot of times people focus their efforts on communication strategies or conflict resolution or the logistics conversations right? Or overly focusing on the pain points that need to be resolved. And those are important, but it's in and of itself insufficient, right? That there also needs to be that time set aside where you really are just dreaming together and you're intentionally not thinking about the pain points or the things that need to be strategized, but really looking at where do we want to go?
Yeah. The relationship is not just a problem to be fixed. So in
Yep.
episode 9, we had a great guest. It was you, Jamie. And so we dug deeper into this question. I'm curious, what at this point, when you think about couples who reach this sort of later stage of their relationship, how can they start thinking now about a purpose that's gonna, I mean, I'll just share briefly a story from my own life. This is a little bit removed, but it's a couple I know, and they really like quote unquote, they like one life. They sold their business. It was 10 figures. They were in their early 60s. They had raised 3 really cool kids. And it was really, I actually thought Tom maybe like stole my story, but it was pretty similar. One of them wanted to go live in Europe where their sort of family was a couple generations back, and the other one wanted to live in rural Utah. So not even like Salt Lake City or something. I mean, it's like flying to Salt Lake City, drive for 6 hours. It was just so interesting to see how hard that was, and they split up because it just like they just wanted very different things. So what are your thoughts of like breadcrumbs that couples can do to start thinking about those big things? When often I imagine, I guess I'll just speak from my own experience. I did a fair bit of prep for my exit, but I just didn't know what I didn't know. There were a lot of things that just until I got there, I couldn't tell you how I was going to react or what I was going to want. There were things that I thought I would have bet you so much money that I would do that I was like, heck no, I'm not doing that. And things that I was like, no way would I ever want to be involved in that. And now I'm like all in. So what are your thoughts on breadcrumbs towards purpose?
This is gonna sound weird, but to me, it's almost you can equate this to your intentions of how you're gonna show up as a parent, right? Like, you have all of these plans about all how you're going to do that, and then you become a parent and sort of goes out the window a little bit,
And it's
right?
easy and it all goes perfectly, right?
Yeah,
Isn't that
like,
what
I was
you're?
a
Yeah.
great parent until I had kids, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, I don't know." I think it's actually quite similar, and so I think the philosophy that I hold around this is to have some loosely held plans, right? That we've got some, ideas that we're working towards, but also recognizing that lifes, and it throws us curveballs, and sometimes even when we plan to a T, we just have a different response than we think we're going to. And so I think that's where we have to be able to default back to the communication. It's almost like the systems, right? The systems in place to uphold and make sure that everything runs. So we have this sort of vision, but recognizing that sometimes that changes. And so defaulting back to, the communication parameters that we've outlined so that we can talk through and renegotiate what it looks like now. And it's just a critical component, I think, because it happens so often where it's like there's such excitement around how I'm gonna show up for this thing, and then the thing happens, and then the response that we have is actually what's most surprising, catches people off guard.
A couple things that come up for me is I like Tom's quote about, communication's the thermostat of your relationship. And so I think, I like that idea of just turning it up as you near these points of transition. But
Mm.
the other thing that comes up, which I'm pretty sure you'll agree with, Jamie, but it's funny because I think of it as somewhat basic, and yet I'm just shocked how few couples do it. And that's not just having some kind of weekly logistics touch point, which going back to Nate's comment of how do you be precise with logistics? Because I mean, I run the childcare schedule in my family, and boy, there's a lot of logistics in there, and getting
Yep.
those precise is really critical. Otherwise, we have conflict. But that is not in and of itself a connection with Anna. And so
Right.
making sure whether it's the same meeting or different, I recommend doing the logistics afterwards because I feel like they can sort of put us in a different state of mind and like get us out of like a present connected state. But it could also just be a different time of how do we connect as a couple about things more like dreams and feelings and successes and failures, whatever it might be, and separate that from the logistics. Because I think
Mhm.
otherwise we can end up being a high functioning or maybe a low functioning, but kind of a team that does stuff together, but not a team that kind of thinks in dreams and philosophizes together. All right, I want to go to our last episode. So this was Caddy and Jamie Duragi. Wonderful couple, all sorts of experience. They actually lead a lot of these retreats with Brian and Jean. But there's a lot we talked about. But one thing that was coming up for me, Jamie, I want to put you on the spot here, is we talked a little bit about the idea of culture and, what is the culture of your relationship? John Gottman is, one of the things he likes to say is that every relationship is a is like it's an intercultural experience, basically. Even if you think you are identical, maybe you have the same religion and you look the same and you come from the same part of the country, that there's always this fusion of the cultures that each individual had from their families, either because of or against, and building a new culture together. So I'm curious, Jamie, what is your family culture for you and Steph?
So our family culture, and I love this question. I think the language that we use has started to evolve around this, right? As our kids are starting to get older. And I think where my brain goes is in a million different directions. So I think about the core values that Seth and I have put in place to guide the culture of our family. And one of the ones that's really, really important to us and the language that we've used with our kids is that we help other people. And so I think being able to, and that is right. My kids are now almost, 6, almost 8 and 10. But we sort of use that as the guidepost, right? And depending on what value we're focusing in on, we use that to start to talk to our kids about it, right? So if the kids get in the car, we're like, tell me about something you did at school that helped somebody else, or tell me something that somebody helped you with and how that made you feel, right? And I think what we're finding though too is that now, especially as our 10-year-old, this was shocking to me. And I know I do this for a living, so I don't know why this was so shocking to me, but like she has really one foot like squarely in adolescence and one foot that is still in childhood. And so she teeters on this, but what I see is her starting to not like push back against our culture or the values that we've set, but to sort of ask more questions about them. And you can start. So I think the interesting thing with our family culture is recognizing that what we're trying to put in place right now isn't probably the same thing that it's going to be, 5 years from now. And so one of the things that we're also working towards culture wise is giving our kids permission to question the culture of the family, right? And to do that in a respectful way. But is this important for you? Not because we've told you that you need to do this, but because it really resonates with you at your core. So I think that's a really long-winded way of saying, right, this kind of culture of questioning and personal identity and development and how that benefits the entire system. Does that make sense?
I do, and I think that you're really bringing your kids in to co-create the culture, I think is wonderful. All right. I'm gonna land the plane. This was a lot of fun, Jamie. I thought it would just be cool if we could do this kind of like retrospective on like what was such a fun season. And to everyone out there listening, it's been so great having you along for the ride. The Business of Us is brought to you by me and Jamie. Music is by our friends at Marmoset, and our theme song is Kenton by Dr. Crosby. Until next season, we wish you the best of luck in making your relationship intentional and remarkable.